Friends, our time together begins as we assemble in the sanctuary at Beth Israel to remember a very special and dear man. Earlier this morning, the family came together with me at the cemetery to accompany our loved one to his final resting place on earth. We were expeditious in our time there, given the heat and humidity, but it was only our goal then to come here, to be surrounded by you, those who knew him well, and shared time with him in all the places, in all the ways that he served life and was a blessing to us. So our time is relaxed, our time is to remember and to give thanks to God for such a blessing in our life, in our community, our world. As we take a moment first to silence cell phones so that we won't be disturbed by them, I'd like to invite Cantor, Trumpeter to set the tone for us with a psalm of consolation.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they will comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forevermore.
When we gather in the sanctuary, this is for many a familiar place to return. On Shabbat, to give thanks to God for the gifts of our life. On bar and bat mitzvah and weddings, to ascend this Bema and to take our rightful place, to be a partner in the Jewish future. And when our life has ended, to come back to this sacred place, to remember, to give thanks. From Psalm 16, I have set the eternal always before me. God is at my side. I shall not be moved. Therefore does my heart exult and my soul rejoice. My being is secure. For you will not abandon me to death, nor let your faithful one see destruction. You show me the path of life. Your presence brings fullness of joy. Enduring happiness is your gift. Death has taken our own Jack Lapin, and in a world that is darkened around us, we grieve. And when there is silence that surrounds us, we feel the loneliness. And when we cry, we feel it more deeply. When we are lost in our sorrow, may we always find the loving presence of family and dearest friends, God, hear us this day and be with us. For Jack's love that united us in life and which death cannot sever, for his companionship that we shared along life's path and which continues through the tenderness of memory, for the gifts of his heart and mind that brought us so much joy and happiness and is now a precious remembrance. For all these and more, we give our thanks to God. When we think of Jack, we think of honesty, truth, goodness. From Psalm 15. O God, who may abide in your house, who may dwell in your holy mountain, those who are upright, who do justly, who speak the truth within their hearts, who do not slander others or wrong them or bring shame upon them, who scorn the lawless but honor those who revere God, who give their word and come what may, do not retract, who do not exploit others, who do not take bribes. Those who live in this way shall never be shaken. Jack lived a long life, known by so many, by all the different ways that he treated us, to his personality, to his joy, to his sadness, to everything that was important to him. A beautiful poem written by Zelda helps us to appreciate by the names by which he was known. In Hebrew, it's called L'chol ish yesh shem. Each man has a name. Each man has a name given him by God and by his father and mother. Each man has a name given him by his stature and his smile, and given him by his clothes. Each man has a name given him by the hills, and given him by his walls. Each man has a name given him by his fate, and given him by his friends. Each man has a name given him by his sins, and given him by his yearnings. Each man has a name given him by his enemies, and given him by his love. Each man has a name given him by his celebrations, and given him by his work. Each man has a name given him by the seasons, and given him by his blindness. Each man has a name given him by the sea, and given him by his death. In his own sorrow, Job cried out, Adonai natan v'Adonai lakach, Yehi shem Adonai mevorach. God has given, God has taken away. Blessed be the name of God. With Job we say, Adonai natan, God, you have given. You gave us a loved one who will surely not be forgotten. For all that was good and enduring in his life, we offer the deepest thanks of our hearts. And yet, O God, you have taken away. We pray for the strength to turn our broken hearts into an altar of trust before we acknowledge your sovereignty and your love, as we say, Yehi shem Adonai mevorach, blessed be the name of God, now and forever. There are many beautiful ways to remember Jack Lapin today, but there is surely no better way than to hear the memories and loving words from his family first. And today, because we know Susan Lapin well, Susan is going to be the first one to take her place here to share words about her dear husband. Susan.
David Letterman on The Late Show had his list of 10, and I have made my list of 10, those 10 special parts of Jack's life, which I think showed how much he loved his life. The order doesn't show the importance of them. I'm just going to give them to you. America, the United States. Jack loved this country. He was so proud of this country. He was so proud that he was an immigrant. He was so proud that he had taken advantage of what this country had to offer. And one of his better days was when he was asked to give a speech at the immediate swearing in of new citizens for this country. And he said he stood up there and looked out on this sea of tiny American flags, and it was a good day. Jack loved people. He loved to hear people's stories. He was always interested in where they came from, what they were doing, whether it was River Oaks or Third Ward or Brazil or Paris. Jack loved books, the physical books. He liked to hold books. He liked to thumb through them. His best stops were bookstores, where he could wander the shelves and pick them out. I often said to him, I think you would rather fondle a book than your wife. And he didn't answer me. Jack loved learning. It was more than just reading in books. It was travel. It was courses, extended courses. He adored his years at Rice. It was just the best for him, and he wanted his children to have this too. Jack loved Herman. He and Herman came over in 1938, and Jack was 7, and Herman was 4. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have any friends. And their parents were so busy working and trying to make a living that they had themselves. And Jack used to tell me, he would turn to Herman and say, Bubby, it's you and me against the world. And this devotion never stopped. It only intensified as the years went on. Jack loved his work in the Jewish community. This synagogue was so special to him. First of all, he could carry on our family's leadership. But then there was the friendship with Rabbi Sam Carve, and that has endured long after he has left. Jack loved the Evelyn Rubenstein JCC. He was asked to lead it when he was very young. And his father said to him, you've got to be crazy. You're building a law practice. You don't need all this. And Jack said, this is what I want to do. Jack loved the American Jewish Committee. It was so much a part of him and has been for 60 years. He was attracted to AJC because of the people who were attracted to the American Jewish Committee and because of the marvelous staff. And his years there were fruitful, happy ones. And when he became what I called a potentate, which was the chairman of the Board of Governors, he met other potentates around the world. And they listened to each other and they learned. Jack loved his practice of law. He loved his partners, dearly loved his partners. He loved bringing an individual and real estate together, making a shidduch. And he loved making money. Jack loved the Estonian. I'm sure you all knew that in the latter years of Jack's life, he had Alzheimer's. And each day he showed such courage. He would wake up to a world that was very different. He didn't know what day of the week it was. Oftentimes, he didn't know where he was going. And I would say to him, "You're going to the Houstonian." And his face would brighten up, because it wasn't because of his athletic ability. I promise you, he had so many wonderful friends at the Houstonian. In fact, one of the more enduring parts of Jack's life was typical of Jack. In the men's locker room, he went up to someone sitting on a bench and he said, "What are you reading?" And Fletcher Thorne Thompson said, "I'm reading Thus and So." And from there, Rick Ashcroft joined the group, and Lou Etherton. And for decades, these four met for lunch once a month. One of them would host and choose the subject, serious books, and good lunches. And they really enjoyed this. And when Jack could no longer read, he was still part of the book club. Wonderful friends and a wonderful family. But there was an intensity about his love for his children. And I think part of it came from the fact that so many of his family were killed in the Holocaust. I don't know. But he wanted, it was his mission. He wanted everything to be offered and let them have the opportunity. He would come home at night tired, play with the kids, and after they were bathed, he would read to them every single night. And as they got older, our dinner tables became jeopardy. There were contests, and Jack would bring up a subject, American presidents, or battles of the Civil War, or state capitals. And we would go around the table, and the last one standing was the winner. And if you were wrong, he would say, "You may be right. Would you like to wager a little something on it?" These children have grown to be such mensches, and they have honored their father in different ways. They have chosen to follow his example of the way he treated women. Jack loved women. He really enjoyed, he felt they were far superior to men. But they saw how he had a companion in intellect, a wife, and a mother. And the most heinous crime you could commit in our home was not murder or theft. It was disrespect to your mother. And I've seen him light out of there after them, and they were running pretty fast. They have honored him by choosing spouses that not only are as good as they are, but probably a little bit better. They have brought to our family such love and such giving. And they have given us grandchildren. Brilliant, smart, beautiful, accomplished. You know what grandchildren are. They are. But our grandchildren are mensches too. And we are so proud of the fact that they look at life and say, life doesn't owe me anything. If I want something, I have to get up and I have to go get it. And they have. Number 10. What did Jack love most? He loved me. And I had him for 63 years. And aren't I lucky?
Susan, your strength has not diminished, and Jack would be so grateful to you right now. as we are. I'd like to call on his son, Bobby, to share his words.
Good luck following that, right? I would, of course, first like to thank Rabbi Lion and Cantor Trumpeter for leading this memorial service for us. As Rabbi Lion said, this Bema, indeed this sanctuary, has been the setting for so many of my family's happiest and saddest life cycle events, and it means a great deal to us to have you by our side again today with us. Thank you, Mom, for having the strength and the moxie to get up here on this day of all days and to share what was truly in your heart. Then again, this should not have surprised any of us, given that those of us who know you so well know that you rarely lack for moxie in the moments where it's needed the most. And on behalf of my brothers and our spouses and our kids, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. Though the brief moments which we will have with you following the service are assured of keeping us from thanking you as personally and as much depth as I know we would like to do so. We want you to know that your presence here means a great deal to us, and we really, really appreciate it. The past several weeks have been rather challenging weeks for our family. We watched the spark of life slowly ebbing away from a man who, for as long as we knew him, had spent his years in a seemingly unending quest to fill and enrich his life with as much learning and as much experience as his resources and his circumstances would allow. And yet, through the course of this final chapter, it was really clear to those of us who were closest to him that while the physiology of disease was working its course, and although certain aspects of his short-term memory had been robbed by the advancement of age, more than enough, much more than enough of his keen mind endured to make him very aware of what was transpiring. And I think we all realize that owing to his gentle spirit and his understanding that there is only so much we can control, he had come to terms with the inevitable, and he was ready to complete the journey. And thanks to the strength and the grace with which my mother quarterbacked this final chapter, my father was able to finish the last days of his life peacefully and in the presence of the love and the care of the family and friends who meant everything to him and whose lives he in turn had enriched. In a few weeks, during the High Holy Days, we're going to read a beautiful passage in the prayer book, which to me has always illustrated a powerful metaphor by reminding us that the light of life is like the flame of a candle. From the time it is kindled, it dances, it glows, it radiates with warmth and beauty, and touches all those within its reach. During those moments, of course, our lives are full. But as we instinctively know, the wick of life is finite. And no matter how dynamic that flame might once have been in its prime, it inevitably loses its vibrancy. It begins to flicker, and ultimately it gutters. And yet, after that light is gone, it is the memory that endures as a perpetual gift to those whose lives it warmed and enhanced. And so today, as we must, our family begins a transition. The sobering moments of recent weeks will begin to give way to the treasure trove of memories of happier times, and of those moments which, when we invoke my father's memory and have the benefit of retrospection, will undoubtedly evoke smiles and admiration, gratitude, and even some awe. So with some indulgence, I'd like to share a few of those memories and highlights which are particularly meaningful to me. There may be a bit of repetition from a few things my mother mentioned, so bear with me in that regard. Someone recently remarked to me that the mere fact that my dad's life began in a tiny home in Grodno, Poland, and ended on the 12th floor of the Huntington on Kirby suggests that the intervening years must have involved a rather remarkable journey. And so they did. Without in any way diminishing the share of difficulties and grief which, as our faith reminds us, from which no one is immune, my father would be the first to tell you that he lived an immensely happy and blessed life. And he never lost sight of the fact that none of it would have happened but for a supremely courageous act on the part of his father, a man whom Dad later reflected was not otherwise a particularly courageous man at all. In October of 1938, my grandparents and their 2 young sons were living a reasonably comfortable life in Grodno, Poland, where my grandfather was a middle manager in a glass factory. As the neighboring Nazi storm clouds grew more threatening, my grandfather, then just aged 38, somehow found the strength and the will to decide to leave it all and to come by boat and then by train to join my grandmother's older sister, Bertha, who years earlier had left Poland and come to Texas. As Dad recalled, his mother, my grandmother, staunchly refused to leave her family in Poland, and she was coaxed by my grandfather to come only on the promise that if a year into it she wasn't happy, he promised her that they would pack up and return back to Poland. Of course, a year later, the Nazis had already invaded Poland, and the fate of those remaining family members who had neither found the will nor the way to escape was sealed. And so it was that at age 7, without any meaningful resources, without speaking a word of English, without knowing a soul here save and except for his Aunt Bertha, my dad and his 4-year-old brother Herman and his parents began in October of 1938 to build life here in Houston, Texas, which, as my dad later remarked, was to his parents a place no less remote or different from the life they had known in Grodno as if they had traveled to the far side of the moon. And yet, like virtually every immigrant story that I'm sure any one of us could tell about our forebears, my grandparents did what they needed to do to build a new life and to create opportunities for their children here. They worked hard, initially running and living above a small delicatessen down on Chenevert Street, downtown, and that's where my dad and Herman worked after school, then later a candy business and a dry cleaners. And while none of these businesses yielded much financial success, they were really enough to enable my grandparents to establish a toehold, a permanent toehold here. And thereby they were able to ensure that the gates through which their sons passed would not be the gates of concentration camps or the gates of displacement camps, but instead the gates of opportunity in the most prosperous land the world had ever known. And that, I assure you, my dad never ever lost in terms of his appreciation for the opportunities that his parents did by gifting him and Herman that new life and that host of opportunities subsequently presented to him. Because he spoke no English, but in an effort to mainstream this 7-year-old boy into the community, the decision was made to place my dad in a school for children with intellectual disabilities until his English had progressed enough to where he could mainstream into a public elementary school and begin to understand what was being taught. And I really believe it was there that my dad's natural thirst for learning first took root and blossomed. One of my favorite stories that he later shared was of the time in elementary school when the kids were taught a unit about the American Civil War. Now this, of course, was a story with which my father was completely unfamiliar. And as the week progressed, and as the teacher led the students through the chronology of the battles and the progress of the war, my dad at age 8 or 9 was literally spellbound. And for reasons that he could never quite remember, that week and that unit ended without the teacher revealing which side had actually won the Civil War. Perhaps it was because the teacher presumed everyone knew the outcome. Perhaps it was because in 1940 in Houston, there were still a few people that refused to accept the outcome. Whatever the reason, my dad was consumed with frustration at not knowing that outcome. And when he went home that Friday, he was not aided one bit when he went to his parents and asked them who won the American Civil War. They, of course, hadn't the foggiest idea what he was talking about. I guess Fort Sumter and Gettysburg were not in the Yiddish school books which educated my grandparents in Poland. Finally, after what he remembered as being an excruciatingly long weekend, my dad returned to school on Monday and finally mustered the courage to ask the teacher what the result was. Now, I can't, of course, cite this event as the precise moment when the habit began, but I can assure you that for the rest of his life, my dad was not about to deny himself the wonder, the opportunity, and the pleasure of feeding his love of learning. As my mother just said, from his earliest days, my dad developed a deep and abiding relationship with books. I don't know about the fondling. That's the first time I heard that, but I'll accept that. I can assure you that that affair endured until his final days. As an adolescent, he would ride the bus downtown to the public library and spend his weekends checking out and reading books. As an adult, he amassed a library in our home unlike anything I ever saw in any of my friends' homes. In our youngest years, he and my mom would take my brothers and me to the bookstore about as frequently as other families might take their kids to Baskin and Robbins or to the zoo. That was our treat, and indeed it was. In the days long before the internet, whenever David or Richard and I had a school project or assignment requiring some research, we knew that somewhere amidst all those shelves of books, the necessary information was later to be found. And later in his adult years, when his birthday would roll around, and friends and family would ask him what he wanted for his birthday, the answer was always the same: a gift certificate to the Brazos bookstore. And its longtime owner, Carl Killian, once remarked that because my dad's birthday fell in the middle of January, and owing to the generosity of his friends and family who would always buy gift certificates to the bookstore, that the official holiday season at the Brazos bookstore didn't end until January 15th, my dad's birthday. And poignantly, years later, on the occasion of my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, my brothers, our spouses, and I hosted a very special anniversary dinner where? In the room of the restored Julia Idison Public Library building on McKinney Street. And we did so because it was in recognition of what that place had meant to my dad all those years earlier. And for him and for us, it was an evening I assure you we will never forget. As my mother said so eloquently, my dad always appreciated the educational and professional opportunities that this wonderful country made available to him. He was given a free education at Rice, and he loved it. He went on to the University of Texas Law School, where he finished near the top of his class. And he was a distinguished moot court champion with his good friend and partner and later U.S. District Judge Norman Black of blessed memory. And yet, notwithstanding the credentials and the honors that my father had earned, in his third year of law school, he could not garner a single interview with any one of the established blue blood Houston law firms. And for one reason: he was Jewish. And in 1954, those law firms were not interviewing or hiring Jews. My dad was frustrated by this. And so he went and talked with Paige Keaton, the then legendary dean of the University of Texas Law School. Dean Keaton was sympathetic. And he told my dad that he thought this exclusionary practice was both immoral and unfair. But he said, "Jack, I'm sorry, there's just nothing I can do about it." Well, I'd like to think that this episode where my dad went to visit Dean Keaton resonated with him, because it was just 3 years later when the dean did do something about it. In 1957, Dean Keaton told the hiring partners at the major Houston law firms that henceforward, if they would not interview any Jewish law students, they were no longer welcome to interview anyone at the University of Texas Law School. Needless to say, that exclusionary practice soon faded into the dustbin of history. After law school, my dad served in the Army, and though we liked to kid him later on that his military service was so distinguished that he entered the service as a private and exited 2 years later with the same rank, he always fondly recalled his Army service as one of the great experiences of his life, primarily because it helped him get into the best physical shape he had ever known, but equally importantly, because it exposed him to a demographic breadth of men whom he likely would never otherwise have come to know, and he always appreciated that. After his Army service, my dad returned to Houston to the practice of law, and he went to work for the firm of Hirsch and Westheimer. And after a year or two there, my mother became pregnant with my brother David. And so my dad went to chat with his boss, Mark Westheimer. He told Mr. Westheimer that he and my mom were expecting their first child, and that candidly he was not sure that he could afford to provide for his soon-to-be growing family on the salary that he was earning as a young associate lawyer. Mr. Westheimer's reply was as straightforward as it was appropriate. "Jack," he said, "at this firm we don't give raises on the basis of need. We give raises on the basis of merit." And so it was. Fair enough, my dad thought, and that's when he left to form his own law practice. Not long thereafter, and what my dad would be the first to tell you was one of the seminal events of his life, Livingston Cosberg introduced my dad to a young lawyer from Helena, Arkansas named Clarence Mayer. And a short time after that, they joined with John Tots to form the law firm of Lapin, Tots, and Mayer. And while they worked very hard and had many bountiful years and some challenging ones, during those days, there was no happier lawyer in the city of Houston than Jack Lapin. He respected and admired Clarence and John's legal and business acumen almost as much as he adored them personally. One of my fondest memories of those days occurred when at age 15 I spent a summer working at the firm. I had been too lazy to get a job, so my dad informed me I would be spending the summer doing drayer-type errands at the firm. Because I was not yet old enough to drive, I rode to work every day with my father. After a few weeks there, I could not help but ask him why. When we arrived around 8:30 in the morning, I would walk by and I would see there was John Tots sitting in his office working away. And when I took a break for lunch, there was John in his office working away. And we would leave at the end of the day around 6:30 or so, walk by John's office, and sure enough, there he was working away. And when I asked my dad what was up with that, he smiled at me and he said, "Bobby, that is the definition of the ideal law partner." Years later, whenever my dad would reminisce about his years with Clarence and John, he would light up. And it was abundantly clear to me that the measure of joy and enrichment that he derived from that special partnership, enhanced very much by Charlene Nelson, his magnificent assistant of over 35 years who naturally became family to us, that feeling never waned to the end of his days. Now, what all of this illustrates to me, not surprisingly, is that above all, it was really the personal relationships that my father treasured the most. He deeply treasured the longest relationship of his life, 85 plus years with his brother Herman. As my mother said, my dad just adored Herman. And throughout the lives that they shared, these two brothers, as my mother said, developed an inseparable bond, which for over 60 of those years was shared with Maxine and my mother. Now, because our extended family would come together every few months for virtually every holiday on the calendar, year after year, one certainty that my brothers and cousins and I could always rely on throughout the years was that at some point during the festivities and every one of those occasions, you would find my dad and Herman sitting off together, off to the side, laughing uproariously about something. They loved to rib each other. And as I recall, no bar mitzvah ever passed without some reference to your much older Uncle Herman or your much older Uncle Jack. Now, those in our generation may not have always understood their jokes or even thought them funny, but the two of them sure did. And their laughter became infectious for the rest of us. And so too did my dad cherish his tie with the person who became, in many ways, the other younger brother in his life, Stephen Kaufman. Whether they were partnering and leading a community project or simply managing a family investment, my dad deeply admired and happily relied upon Stephen's keen intellect and judgment. And when Ann joined the family and they and my folks began to share travels throughout the world together, it was for my father yet another relationship which brought him so many happy moments. But there was, as you've no doubt picked up by now, one relationship in my father's life which, it can fairly be said, eclipsed all others without there being a second place anywhere in sight, and which served as his greatest source of joy. Winston Churchill, who arguably lived as remarkable and full a life as anyone ever has, ended his memoir with a one-sentence summation of his life. He wrote, "I married Clementine Holzier and lived happily ever after." Without question, if asked to sum up his life in a single sentence, I'm quite sure my father would answer, "I married Susan Kaufman and lived happily ever after." At the age of 24, as a second-year law student, he met and fell in love with the then 18-year-old Susan, and he decided he wanted her and only her. Equally significantly, and trust me, much to the consternation of her parents, who envisioned that she would enjoy 4 years of college on the West Coast, she decided she wanted him and only him. And for those who know my parents, once they jointly set their minds to an end, nothing was going to stop them. My father married my mother when she was 19 and he was 25, and as I said, lived happily ever after, 63 plus years. Now, my father knew that in marrying my mother, he had chosen someone who not only shared his values and his desire to explore all that life had to offer, but someone who was also possessed of a strong will and strong opinions. He used to joke that one of his most sobering moments occurred just moments after their wedding ceremony had ended. He was riding the elevator down to the floor where the wedding reception was to be held. The only two people in the elevator were my dad and his new father-in-law, my grandfather, Colonel Al Kaufman. After the elevator doors closed and the two of them were alone heading down to the reception, my grandfather turned to my father, smiled, and said, "Well, Jack, she's all yours now." My dad later said that at that moment a cold chill ran down his spine and he was tempted to ask, "Is it too late to give her back?" Truth be told, my father embraced that challenge, and it became for him the predominant joy of his life. From that moment on, everything he did, professionally, personally, communally, was not only for my mother, but importantly, it was with my mother. Theirs was a partnership which was truly symbiotic. The sum of the whole exceeded the sum of the parts. Each introduced the other to fields of interest which the other willingly embraced and came to treasure. Early on, they chose to become lifelong learners, and their appetite for broadening their own horizons never waned. I recall an occasion when I was a teenager back in the 1970s. Beth Israel produced a booklet for its 125th anniversary, and for that booklet, the congregation asked its lifelong members to submit a photo of them doing something which illustrated what they truly enjoyed doing in life. Now, naturally, some couples submitted a photo of them with their kids, or perhaps on some grand adventure. Not my folks. The photo that my parents submitted was a classic for them. It was of the two of them sitting in bed in their pajamas, each reading a book, and in between them on the bed was a half-gallon tub of ice cream with 2 spoons sticking out of either side. The simple truth is that my father was unabashedly in love with my mother from day one until day last. He knew the dimensions that she had brought to his life, and he was ever grateful for them. You might now well understand why, as my mother referenced growing up in my home, the unparalleled prime directive of the Jack Lapin household for my brothers and for me was as simple as it was unqualified. Never, ever disrespect your mother. And on those few occasions, when, owing to the expected stupidity which comes with adolescence, we foolishly violated that rule, well, let's just say that you had committed, shall we say, a grievous error of judgment for which there was hell to pay. Beyond that one inviolate dictate, though, there were, in truth, very few rules growing up in our home. As long as we acted responsibly and acquitted ourselves well enough elsewhere, my brothers and I were given every opportunity we could want and just about every freedom we sought. Our years growing up together were very happy ones, and as my mother referenced, dinners together in particular were a real priority. And, as she said, were frequently occupied with quizzes and games in which we enthusiastically participated and competitively challenged each other, always in a fun way. I recall one occasion when Richard, who was probably in the 2nd or 3rd grade, happened to mention that he had just completed a book report on Theodore Roosevelt. My dad asked Richard to recount a few of the most significant accomplishments of Teddy Roosevelt's life and presidency. And when Richard was giving his answer, Richard quoted some event or date, which my dad promptly challenged as being not quite accurate. Well, confident in his work, Richard assured my dad that it was my dad and not Richard who was wrong about the date. With that, my father uttered that phrase that became well known in our household that my mother referenced, where he said, "Well, you may be right. Just how confident are you about that date?" Richard quickly accepted, wagering the currency of all bets in our household, a favor, which meant that the loser had to perform some chore or task that the winner requested. Winning a favor was a big deal in our household because it gave you the chance to stick someone else with a very undesired task. Well, never ones to miss out on what we thought was easy action, David and I quickly jumped in and joined Richard's side of that action and that bet. Because after all, Richard had just recently consulted the book itself, and he confidently assured us that he had the date right. You know the end of this. As soon as that bet was sealed, my father, who knew a thing or two about Theodore Roosevelt, explained why the year Richard had quoted could not possibly have been right. And he invited Richard to fetch the book, open it, and confirm what my father had said. Sure enough, Richard had misread the page and inadvertently quoted the wrong date. And when my dad saw how David and I, each having just squandered a precious favor in reliance upon Richard's ability to properly read a book, that we were prepared to summarily execute him for what he had just done to us, my dad burst out laughing so hard and for so long that I thought he was going to choke to death. And as I was thinking about it, I think that's the loudest and hardest I ever heard my dad laugh in his entire life. He loved sharing those dinners to nurture in each of us his shared interest in history and the world around us, and he did so in a manner that was always fun and enjoyable. I know my father loved being a father. He weathered quite well the inevitable occasions when David, as the oldest child almost always does, tested the boundaries of what was and was not appropriate behavior. And as the middle child, I, of course, was able to go to school on my older brother's mistakes and accomplish the same ends without getting in trouble. And in our adult years, David and I found a way to forgive our parents for seemingly eliminating all the rules for their youngest son and letting Richard get away with anything. Somehow my parents emerged from parenthood without too many battle scars and seemed only too happy to consign us full-time to our own spouses when it was time for us to marry. Indeed, my dad so lovingly embraced and adored Carol, Eve, and Jim that, fearing the answer, my brothers and I never had the nerve to ask him, between us and our spouses, whom he loved the most. And by the time they became grandparents, my parents' batteries were suitably recharged, and they embraced that opportunity with great energy and joy. Whether on wonderful trips together, or at some cultural event, or simply at one of my mother's dinners where the table would be full of food, decorations, and laughter, Lindsay, Laura, Oliver, Elliot, and Alec always knew that in their Mimi and Poppy they could count on an endless reservoir of generosity, of advice, and of unqualified love. I can't leave the subject of my dad's grandchildren without readily confessing one admission. I haven't a clue what happens to us after we die. But I do know this. From this time forward, I am going to allow myself the indulgence of thinking that perhaps right now, and maybe for every moment on which I wish it to be so, that my father is going to be happily reunited with the beautiful grandson, Oliver, whom he lost 15 years ago, and that they are going to hold each other tight, laugh, and play as they did so often, and that they will do so for eternity. That thought, that wish, however remote its accuracy might be, is going to bring me great comfort from this day forward. Over the course of his life, owing to his many leadership positions and no small shortage of family celebrations, my dad had the opportunity to deliver a healthy share of speeches and toasts. He was a wonderful speaker, not only just because he spoke from the heart, but also because he possessed a great knack for boiling down the message he was trying to convey to a single and cogent theme, a single takeaway thought. In that spirit, and in thinking through with what to close today, I pose this question to myself. If someone asked my dad near the end of his days to reflect back on his life journey and to share what one sentiment most permeated his feelings, I have a pretty good idea what word he might select, and that word is gratitude. He was forever grateful to have been born of parents who, at the moment it was needed most, found the courage to give up all that they knew and valued, to venture to a new world that they had never seen and to start over with next to nothing, just to ensure a future for their sons and their progeny. He was forever grateful for the opportunities this country and his transplanted hometown of Houston presented to his family and to him, and the impact of those opportunities on him was unmistakable. He, nourished by my mom's full encouragement and support, embarked upon a decades-long journey of expressing his thanks to the community by giving of his time, his talents, and his resources countless times over, so as to ensure that the communal institutions which he felt had so enriched his life would be strengthened to do the same for the generations which followed. In that fashion, his service as president of Beth Israel, of the Jewish Community Center, as chairman of the board of the National Board of Governors of AJC, just to name but a few, reflected, I believe, not just the product of a generous spirit, but at its essence, the manifestation of how grateful he always was to a country and to a community which had embraced his family and enriched his life by providing him with opportunities he would never have been able to experience in the old country. He was every day of his life forever grateful for the friends he cherished, the family he adored, and the gift of a life partner who completed him. And so, as we begin that painful transition as a family from time together to a reservoir of memories, I will try to remind myself just how grateful my father always was for all that life had brought him. And for my part, I will remain forever grateful to have been blessed to have him as my dad. May his memory forever be an abiding blessing to those whose lives he touched.
Such a magnificent way to recall a man who has touched each of us in such magnificent deeds. I want to acknowledge that in this room sits past presidents of this congregation, a team of rivals, a team of men and women who with him led this great institution and also forged a future for the Jewish community around us in Houston. I want to acknowledge Rabbi Sam Carve. Rabbi Carve, you and Jack shared a journey together during your role as senior rabbi of this congregation from 1975 to 1999. And it is the 30-year anniversary of the Schlenker School that was founded in the Kaufman building, that was truly a product of your vision and Jack's vision too. Because when you came together with Jack, even if he didn't acknowledge or agree initially, it was his intellectual curiosity that led him to the same conclusion that you, Sam, led him to understand. And then a school began, and the Schlenker School continues to be a gem in the crown of Reformed Jewish day schools in this country. I know he cherished your friendship, Sam, and your intellect just as much as you appreciated his friendship and his deeds over so many years that you shared. And I also want to acknowledge Stephen Bema and David Harris from Washington, D.C., from the leadership of the AJC who are here, because there are very few who have been untouched by such a great man. Bobby, you asked, you don't know what happens after this life. It's such a Jewish conundrum, but I will tell you that we've been given many answers. And one of them I always begin by saying, until someone comes back to tell us, we just don't know. But what we do know is that a good name endures beyond the grave, and that for sure the good name of Jack Lapin will endure in all the ways that we continue to remember from that reservoir of experiences that you spoke of so kindly. And yes, if Jack and Oliver are embraced, there's no one to prove that it isn't happening. So why not take the pleasure in knowing that neither one of them is alone today? Sometimes we say that we pick the Torah portions that we wish to read and study, but then there are times when we say that the Torah portion chooses us. Bobby, when you spoke of gratitude, when we open the Torah portion this week, we read 3 Hebrew words, V'achalta, v'savata, uveirachta. It means eat, enjoy life, consume the food and nourish yourself. V'savata, and not just a little, but a lot. And as Jack pursued his life, not only did he come to eat well and share his abundance with others so they should eat too, but then the third term is uveirachta, and give thanks. So the Torah portion speaks to us today. How appropriate that gratitude is truly the word on which we end today as we appreciate the life that he lived. When I came to the house last week and spent a few moments with Susan and Jack, it was an opportunity to validate for Jack that he was a faithful Jewish man. He was faithful to God, not because he worshiped every day, but because he participated in the covenant God made with him to bear witness to God's teachings. He was faithful to Torah. Jack lived by the highest ethical calling of our faith tradition. He loved his neighbor, he welcomed the stranger, and he treated every person equally. He was faithful to Israel, the people Israel, the land of Israel. They both earned his attention and deep focus. And at the helm of AJC, he found a home in its mission to combat rising anti-Semitism and extremism, to defend Israel's place in the world, and safeguard the rights and freedoms of all people. And so Jack was grateful for the life that he led and the opportunities that he was provided. Grateful for his family, the opportunities to be an American, where justice, happiness, and liberty became the foundation on which he built his life and placed his trust. Rabbi Jacob Rudin taught, "Let it not be said that life was good to us, but rather that we were good to life." Jack Lapin, from sacred beginning to sacred end, was good to life. And we, the beneficiaries of his goodness, are enormously grateful too. Zichrono livracha, may the memory of Jack Lapin be a source of strength and blessing to us now and always. Amen. Let us take just a moment for silent prayer to collect our own thoughts and personal memories of our loved one.
Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki ata L'chol hashalom, ki ata hu melech adon. L'chol hashalom, shalom rav al Yisrael amcha, tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha, tasim leolam. V'tov b'einecha levarich et amcha Yisrael b'chol lit u'v'chol shah b'shlomecha. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha, tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha, tasim leolam. Tasim leolam. Tasim leolam.
May the memory of Jack Lapin endure among us as a blessing. In your own time, O God, when we too are called to enter eternity, may we leave this life secure in the faith that in your light we shall see light. In life and in death we cannot go where you are not, and where you are, hope endures. Sustained by this assurance, we invoke your name, Almighty God. Please rise.
El male rachamim, shochin mamromim, hamitzim nochanochana, tachat kanfei hashechina, im kroshim נשמת יעקב בן חיים ורבקה שהלך לעולמו. בעל הרחמים יסירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ביצרור החיים את נשמתו. Adonai hu nachalato, v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo, v'nomar Amen.
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Jack Lapin, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let it find refuge in your eternal presence, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. We join now in reciting the words of Kaddish, not a prayer about death or sorrow or salvation, but rather an ancient praise to God, in whose presence we find all that we need. In his memory and in his honor, we say, Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi, v'yalma divrachu te v'yamlich malchute, v'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayei d'kol beit Yisrael, b'gala v'zman kari v'imru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbi mevarach le'olam alon me'amaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yidadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei d'gudisha brichu, le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, damiram b'yama v'imru Amen. Yehei shlam araba min shemaya, v'chaim ma'aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom b'romav, Hu yaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. May the one who causes peace to reign in the high heavens cause peace to reign upon each of us. Before we leave this place, let us take comfort in what Rabbi Morris Adler also teaches. Those I have loved, though now beyond my view, have given form and quality to my being, and they live on unfailingly feeding my heart and mind and imagination. They led me into the wide universe I continue to inhabit, and their presence is more vital to me than their absence. What thou givest, O Lord, thou takest not away, and bounties once granted shed their radiance evermore. Friends, a meal of condolence awaits us in the Wolf Tumim Hall behind the sanctuary. As well, at 6 p.m. this evening in the Gordon Chapel, all are welcome to return for a Shiva Minion with the family. Rabbi Scott and Cantor Trumpeter will lead. Please remain in your places now so that we may leave the Bema and escort the family to Wolftumum Hall. The greatest mitzvah now is to bring comfort to those who mourn and to keep alive precious memories of our loved one. This concludes our service.